And now it is my honor to introduce our moderator for the U.S. government panel discussion. P.J. Crowley is a professor of practice and a distinguished fellow at the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communications here at George Washington University. P.J. appears frequently as a national security commentator on national and global television networks. His opinion pieces have been published in a wide range of print and online outlets, including the Washington Post, The Guardian, and BBC. P.J. served as the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs and spokesman for the U.S. Department of State between 2009 and 2011 under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and was the primary U.S. government interlocutor with major media regarding the impact of the release of classified diplomatic cables by WikiLeaks. He resigned from that position after making public comments critical of the government's pretrial treatment of Private First Class Bradley Chelsea Manning, and Atlantic Magazine named him as one of the 21 brave thinkers in 2011. After leaving the State Department, PJ held the 2011-2012 Omar Bradley Chair of Strategic Leadership at the Penn State Dickinson School of Law and School of Public Affairs, Dickinson College, and the Army War College. While there, he authored The Rise of Transparency and Decline of Secrecy in the Age of Global and Social Media for the Penn State Journal of Law and International Affairs. And before joining the Obama administration, PJ was a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, with a particular focus on homeland security in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. He authored a number of detailed analyses on security issues, including Safe at Home, a national security strategy to protect the American homeland, improve national preparedness, and rebuild the U.S. standing in the world. He remained engaged on these issues as a member of the Aspen Institute Homeland Security Group. His most recent analysis in this area is Homeland Security in the post-9/11 era, published by the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy. PJ is a retired Air Force colonel and is a veteran of Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm in 1991. He served on the National Security Council staff at the White House as a special assistant to President Clinton and deputy press secretary. He deployed to NATO headquarters in Brussels during the 1999 Kosovo crisis to support then NATO Secretary General Javier Solana, helping to develop a strategic communication capability in support of the NATO campaign. And PJ, I'd like to thank you very much for your service to our country, and we look forward to your moderating this panel today.
Thanks very, very much. Sitting in the right place. Good start. Well, thank you all for coming. As Mary reminds us, the Berlin Wall went down almost 26 years ago. My wife and I were stationed in Europe at the time, and yet we know that the Cold War in this hemisphere just ended in the past few months. And as a practitioner of public diplomacy, as the United States seeks to build bridges around the world pays attention to what we say, but the world in particular pays attention to what we do. And probably there is no more powerful statement that the United States has made in this hemisphere in recent decades than the one that President Obama made when he fundamentally changed US-Cuba policy a few months ago. And this would still be subject of significant debate in this country were it not for the transformative moment we also find ourselves in with respect to Iran. But most of the practitioners here within government probably think this is a very good thing. Let Iran take all the headlines, and these individuals will quietly try to build the new relationship between the United States and Cuba. And that's the focus of our discussion today. And leading us off is going to be Joan Perkins, one of the point people of the State Department in terms of constructing a new relationship from a policy standpoint between the United States and Cuba. She's the Deputy Coordinator of Cuban Affairs in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere under Assistant Secretary of State Roberta Jacobson. She has a very rich background in the region, and I think Joan is in a great position not only to tell us what this means in terms of bilateral relations, but what this means in terms of the benefits the United States will accrue, throughout the region now that this obstacle, this big deal has been transformed. So Joan, kick us off.
Great. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to first start by thanking all of you for your attendance and your interest and your enthusiasm for working on cultural, educational, and citizen exchanges with Cuba. You've heard a lot about the December 17th announcement by the president. It really did change the course of our relationship with Cuba. For more than 5 decades, we had held on to a policy of isolation. And thanks to the courage and vision of President Obama and President Castro, we're on a very new and different path. We're really in uncharted territories. Our new policy of engagement allowed us to reestablish diplomatic relations and to reopen embassies in both of our countries. And I can tell you that a lot of hard work and dedication and patience went into those events behind the scenes. And there are some folks here in the audience from my team who can attest to that personally, I know. After the December 17th announcement, our negotiating teams for the United States and for Cuba met on 3 separate occasions, rotating between Havana and Washington to try to hammer out the details of reestablishment. And what would the relationship look like, and how would we go about this? While those negotiations were happening to reestablish relations, we also continued with our separate work on substance and issues that are of mutual concern to both countries. So issues like human rights and counter-narcotics, civil aviation, trafficking in persons, migration, all of those sort of substantive dialogues continued on their own separate tracks as well. The next thing that we came to was July 1st, the announcement that the president made that we intended to formally establish relations and reopen embassies, and that the effective date of both things would be July 20th. And so on July 20th, we did a presidential exchange of letters. President Castro delivered a letter to Deputy Secretary Blinken here in Washington, and President Obama's letter was delivered by our Chief of Mission, Jeff De Laurentiis, in Havana there. And by that exchange, we officially reestablished relations. On the same day, you may have seen that the Cuban embassy here in Washington officially reopened, did their ceremonial reopening here of their embassy and raised their flag. And we waited a few weeks to do that in Havana. But this was all a really significant step in our relationship to this point. We see it as an opportunity for the Cuban people to have new opportunities, increased resources available to them, to really improve their own lives and move Cuba along this path toward greater openness and prosperity. Getting back for a second to the August 14th flag raising that we did, I'm just curious, how many of you watched that on TV? Raise your hands. A good number of you. You can imagine in my office we were glued to the TV, those of us who didn't get to travel to Havana. And for those of you who didn't see it live, Secretary Kerry traveled to Havana. It was the first time in many, many years a Secretary of State had set foot on the ground in Cuba. And he raised the flag with the help of the retired Marines who had actually taken down the flag so many years before. That was a particularly poignant thing for many of us to watch. While he was on the ground, he met with the Cuban Foreign Minister, Bruno Rodriguez. He talked and interacted with prominent Cuban Americans, Cuban artists and cultural leaders, civil society, the diplomatic corps, a wide range of actors in civil society. And now that we're on the other side of this big milestone, and we actually have diplomatic relations, really our goal is the same. Our goal remains to empower the Cuban people and support the emergence of a democratic, prosperous, and stable Cuba. That's been the goal of this administration all along. We think the new approach, though, and with relations, we have better access and we'll be able to further that policy in terms of our access, not just to the Cuban government, but also to the Cuban people. In a nutshell, the new policy is very forward-looking. It recognizes the struggles and the sacrifices of the past, which are significant for Cuban Americans. We definitely want to pay respects to that. But the new policy looks forward and emphasizes the value of people-to-people relations and increase ties through communication, trade, and a respectful dialogue. And that's sort of the building block for the new relationship. In terms of what comes next, we get a lot of questions about this. Everybody says, what's next? Are we normalized now? Do we have relations with Cuba? Are we back like on a regular track? The answer is not exactly. We have diplomatic relations, but normalization is a very long and complicated process. We don't expect changes to happen overnight. We can't wave a magic wand and sort of start over with the Cuban government. Reestablishment of diplomatic relations is just an early step in this process. And normalization is going to be a longer-term process that involves a lot of dialogue and engagement between our two governments and our peoples. Secretary Kerry said in Havana on the 14th that both he and the Cuban Foreign Minister Rodriguez are determined to look forward and to look ahead. We're approaching the process of normalization with the same resolve and dedication that we approached reestablishment with, but it's going to take some effort, it's going to take some work. I'm sorry to those of you in my office, like we're going to still be rolling up our sleeves and working really hard for the next year or so at least. In Havana, the next sort of big step is that we're going to hold a meeting of the Bilateral Steering Committee. Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Rodriguez decided when they sat down in Havana that we needed to have a committee that could sort of look at the range of issues and decide how to attack those issues and when to schedule certain dialogues on different topics. Everything from human rights to civil aviation to counter-narcotics. That we needed to be sort of strategic and to sit down together to socialize those priorities and kind of plan them out. And the first one of those meetings, the first Bilateral Steering Committee, is actually going to happen this Friday in Havana. Deputy Assistant Secretary Alex Lee from my bureau is going to go down and lead those talks for us, along with our Ambassador Jeff De Laurentiis in Havana. And we're hoping that this is going to move us forward. These discussions are going to move us forward. They're going to help enhance a mutual understanding that we have with the Cuban government and identify a clear way forward for how we'll tackle especially some of the tougher issues in the relationship. Promoting the free flow of information has been a big part of this, and my colleagues from Commerce and Treasury are going to talk in more detail about how we've done that in terms of regulations changes. But people-to-people exchanges and information flows have been a key component of this administration's policy, not just recently, but for many, many years. A number of U.S. universities had independently and successfully forged academic partnerships in Cuba, and we've seen the scholars and students going back and forth between our two countries for coursework, study abroad programs, international conferences, and we're hoping that easing of the travel restrictions that we saw on January 16th will continue to facilitate those exchanges and make it easier for you to do that. We're happy to see, even though this has been happening for some time now, we're really happy to see, since we've established relations, a real uptick in interest for folks who want to participate in academic exchanges, for people who want to participate in people-to-people travel. And we want to encourage those kinds of partnerships and exchanges going forward. The amendments to our regulations that my colleagues will talk about in more detail really support the interaction between our two peoples. And as the President has said, and I believe this firmly, our citizens are our best ambassadors. So we hope to continue to facilitate that. I think I'll stop there, but I want to thank you for your time and attention, and I'll look forward to answering your questions as we get a little further along.
Very good. I should say, for those of you in the audience, you should have received a piece of paper that allows you to pose a question. So as the panel is giving its introductory remarks, if there's anything you want to ask them, by all means, jot that down, pass it to a member of the GW staff that's lurking here, and then we'll take the greatest of the questions and pose them to our esteemed panel. I was asking Jeff Braunger, our next speaker. He's the Chief Licensing Division of the Office of Foreign Assets Control at the Department of Treasury. I said, are you still in business? He says, oh yeah. But I think in terms of how complicated this is and how long this is going to take, Jeff has been at OFAC for 20 years, and he has gone through previous transitions as well, including Vietnam, Cambodia, Serbia. So he has a great sense of how long this is going to take, how difficult this is going to be. But in terms of helping us understand, what now will be permitted, what now may still be subject to licenses, Jeff, give us your perspective.
Yeah, first, I wanted to mention I'm also, a product of educational exchanges on the U.S. side. I participated in 3 of them between high school and graduate school, so I always found that area very interesting. And then for the 25 years at OFAC, 20 years of that time has been spent on Cuba, and within that 20 years, I've either been reviewing or assigning licensing determinations related to travel to Cuba, related to educational activities. So on January 16th, as a result of the President's announcement in December, we amended our regulations. And if you've looked at our Federal Register notice that came out, it has a summary of the 12 areas that we amended those regulations, which included the area of telecommunications, redefining cash in advance for exporters, transactions related to banking institutions, and also related to air carrier and travel agencies, how they don't need to get permission from us anymore to go ahead and make travel arrangements for people, which should help facilitate an easier flow of travel to Cuba. But the primary area that I wanted to focus on with the limited time, if you could bring the slide up now, we'll see if that works. Hey. Usually I have lots of slides and lots of technical information, so I just have 2. And none are very flashy. There's no pictures of old American cars or anything. So these are the 12 categories of travel. And as you know, many of you may know that these are, by statute, the 12 that were permitted to authorize travel to Cuba, within these areas. And so the big change in the travel area, which is a big facilitator of educational exchange or exchanges with Cuba, is that these categories are now authorized under a general license provision. So if you know, many of you I've worked with over the years, the definition of general license versus specific license is if for general license you read the regulation, and if you meet the requirements of that regulation, where it states in the regulation you are authorized, you can go forward without any permission from us. If it says it's a specific license requirement, then it's a case-by-case review by our office, and we issue you a document on Treasury letterhead. So now the vast majority of travel falls under a general license provision, so there's no more waiting in line to hear from us, and you need to go to these regulations and review the details of it, and if you determine you qualify, then you can go to one of these travel agencies or air carriers who are now permitted to go forward without any permission from us and have your, book your travel. But you still have to certify that you fall within the scope of one of these categories of travel before they can make the arrangements for you. But looking at these categories, I think the ones that may have the most influence in the area of exchanges would be item 4, professional research and professional meetings, and number 5, educational activities, and number 7, public performances, clinics, workshops, competitions, and exhibitions. In the professional research area, there already existed a general license for full-time professionals or people doing research in their professional area to go to Cuba. Now the expansion there is that there's no more reference to that the research be non-commercial and academic in nature. So it's now expanded to that it can be of commercial research. And also graduate level full-time study related research falls within the professional research area, which is also a subcategory in educational activities, but it's more restricted in educational activities. And then in the professional meetings area, you may recall if you've gone to meetings in Cuba, how you had to apply for a specific license from our office to attend a Cuba meeting. The general license in the past covered international organizations meetings in Cuba, but you had to come in to our office to get a license to attend a Cuba sponsored meeting. And so now, again, you can go forward and attend meetings in Cuba. The only exception is meetings that are for the purpose of promoting tourism in Cuba. That remains prohibited. On the educational activities category, that back in 2011 was already amended through the President's statement regarding purposeful travel. And so a lot of that category had already been under a general license provision before the change. So sending class down to Cuba, or graduate, undergraduate students doing academic research related to doing their thesis or dissertation, students attending a Cuban university, or a U.S. professor teaching in Cuba, a Cuban scholar coming to the United States. Those were all in there. Also the preparation of those activities, those were all a part of the existing general license prior to the change. What was added was high school educational exchanges were brought back. Those were eliminated in June of 2004. So now that has come back. And also what we used to call academic service providers, those who assisted universities, organizations that provided assistance to universities to make academic setting arrangements in Cuba. They no longer need a license from us. That falls under the current general license. And also the area of universities putting on professional or putting on academic conferences, workshops, and seminars, that required a specific license prior to the change, and now that also falls under the general license provision for educational activities. But educational activities has two subcategories. So what I just mentioned was the first subcategory, the general license A, and that covered academic-oriented activities, university level. The second part under B, the B general license for that category, is people-to-people travel. And so that originated back during the Clinton administration from 1999 to 2003. We were issuing licenses for people-to-people travel, and that was eliminated. And then that was brought back during the President's Statement of Purposeful Travel in 2011, but it required a specific license. So many of you who applied may recall, there was quite an interest in obtaining these licenses, very high volume of applications, and also required lengthy reports. So that provision is now under a general license authorization, so you no longer need to apply for a license from us. And that the main component of that is that you have a full-time schedule of meaningful interaction between the U.S. travelers and the Cuban people. So just maybe going to a museum or going to the cemetery, going to a farm, to qualify under the regulation, there has to be this interaction with the Cuban people, a meaningful interaction, full-time schedule. And then moving on to the item 7, public performances, clinics, workshops, competitions, and exhibitions. Here, organizations can put on clinics and workshops, or they can put on these exhibitions. Athletic groups or universities, sports teams can go down and participate in activities with the Cuban people. There's some requirements in this, like donating proceeds or profits after costs, and that it be open to the public, and in relevant situations that there be interaction with or participation with the Cubans in the event. So anyways, when you go to our regulations, you can get all the details. Usually I have like a 15, 20 page slideshow with all kinds of very exciting detail. And so I'm kind of sparing you that. And then the last slide, which I guess I get to do myself. Hey. This is our contact information. So if you want to see these regulations, or we have frequently asked questions that summarize a lot of even the travel area, very specific to types of travel, that's our website. If you drop the OFAC and replace it with Cuba, that'll take you right to our Cuba information webpage. And then you can call us or write us. And another more popular way to get some information from us, if you have a specific scenario but you're not really looking for interpretive guidance or applying for a license, you can send us an email at the OFAC_feedback@treasury.gov. And then two main points, which I guess is pretty apparent, but with these regulations, we have not lifted the embargo, and tourist travel is still not authorized.
Okay. Alan W. Christian is the Senior Export Policy Analyst in the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce. Most notable in his biography is that he is one of our own, and we welcome a graduate of the George Washington University, back to campus. I suppose a lot of people want to do business, with now a new emerging market in Cuba. Alan, how is that going to work?
All right. Well, first off, I want to thank GW and Sister Cities International as well as the State Department for having us here this morning. It's wonderful to be here and talk to you about Cuba and the exciting changes that have happened. So just a little background, the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Commerce Department administers what are called the Export Administration Regulations. And we are an export control agency, and historically we have administered what are considered dual-use export controls, controls of items being exported that could be used for both military as well as civil uses. With the President's current export control reform, we've actually been receiving some less sensitive military items from the State Department to control under a more flexible regulatory regime. So within that context, also on January 16th, the Bureau of Industry and Security published regulations or a rule revising our regulations that affected multiple parts regarding Cuba. The most significant was the creation of what's called license exception support for the Cuban people. And within the Export Administration Regulations, a license exception is similar to an OFAC general license in that it's a general authorization that provides you with authorization, in this case, to export items as long as you meet the terms and conditions. That license exception support for the Cuban people has multiple parts. It allows certain exports to the private sector in Cuba to support independent economic activity, as well as to improve living conditions in Cuba. It also has an element that authorizes certain exports to support civil society in Cuba. And then the last part is to improve the free flow of communications in Cuba by allowing certain telecommunications items that would be used to improve or create the telecommunications infrastructure. Another part of the January rule was to remove a requirement for what are called gift parcel consolidators, companies primarily in the United States that collect gifts that people want to send primarily to their families in Cuba. Those gift parcel consolidators used to have to obtain a license from us to be able to provide that service. Since January, we removed that requirement so that it's easier for people to send gifts to the Cuban people. A final part, two actually. One was to allow sales of certain what we call consumer communications devices to Cuba. In 2009, we created the license exception called consumer communications devices that was limited to donations of certain authorized items to eligible end users. In January, we said that those sales could be made of those items as well. And then we created a licensing policy regarding environmental protection. So people would still have to come to us requesting a license, but we have a favorable licensing policy for the export of items that would be used for environmental protection in Cuba to help with Cuban environment as well as the international environment. In July, on July 22nd, we published a second rule to implement the rescission of Cuba's state sponsor of terrorism designation. That rule was administrative. It removed references to Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism in our regulations. And as a result of that rescission, certain things became more eligible for Cuba. Certain license exceptions were expanded because of it coming off the list, as well as we no longer have jurisdiction over certain foreign-made items that are what we call exported from abroad to Cuba. So we not only have jurisdiction over items in the United States being exported to Cuba, we have jurisdiction over certain foreign-made items located abroad, as well as U.S. origin items located abroad. And now, since Cuba is no longer a state sponsor of terrorism, fewer foreign-made items located abroad are subject to our regulations, and therefore those items wouldn't require our authorization to be exported to Cuba. So that's just a broad overview, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Very good. Thank you. Robin Lerner is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Private Sector Exchange, the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs under Evan Ryan. And this is your second tour at the State Department. Served in the State Department, then went up on the Hill. Might ask you whether serving in post-conflict societies like Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq is harder than working on the Hill. But it runs the exchange visitor program, and obviously we'll be overseeing that flow of people-to-people exchanges that we hope will help to transform the relationship between the United States and Cuba.
Thank you, PJ, and thank you, all of you, for coming today. I'm also a lawyer, so I know better than to get sucked into your questions. So it's, Evan put this in a really wonderful framework for everybody, that the people-to-people ties that we can create and that have already been happening for so many years, thanks to Sister Cities, is so vital at this historic time. I mean, it's really a historic time, so let's not forget that the gravity or the meaningfulness of this moment. So I'm very happy to be here to be able to talk about the J1 Exchange Visitor Program. So just quickly, who in the audience is a sponsor, a J1 visa sponsor, a J1 program sponsor? Great. It's hard to see with these lights. Okay, great. Well, that's fantastic. So a lot of you are not. So I'm going to explain a little bit of what the Exchange Visitor Program is. So just coming back to the reason for having this session in the first place, when the announcement came out that we were going to be normalizing relations, we started getting phone calls from sponsors with interest in what can we do with Cuba. And we want to bring Cubans here. Now, the J1 Exchange Visitor Program is an inbound into the United States program. It's not an outbound program. It is inbound. And we call it private sector exchange because it's a system where the State Department writes regulations for programs. We're authorized to do so. And then we try to step out of the way and let American organizations build those people-to-people relations under our authorization through regulations that we draft and we monitor the programs. But utilizing this private sector system, something like 280,000 people globally came into the United States last year on one of the 13 different categories of exchanges that are authorized. That's a really big number, and that's just new in the last year. Some of our programs are multi-year, so at any given time we may have something like 500,000 people here on a different kind of J1 program. We like to think of it in ECA as diversification, so we have a number of really amazing programs that we fund, State Department funds. We're very involved in the grants and the whole conceptualization and running of those programs. And those are a bit smaller in number because they're quite costly, and there aren't always places where we can do that in big numbers. So having this private sector system allows us to let bigger flows happen, privately funded. So there are no US dollars that are being put into these programs. There are some exceptions to that, but for the large part, there are not. So with this system, in last year, we had a total of 49 exchange visitors from Cuba came on a J1. Now that is not really big for, in objective terms, but it's pretty big in relative terms for Cuba. So we know that there are a lot of organizations that want to increase that, and I'll tell you, among that 49, the largest program were short-term scholars. So in the J1, you have a number of programs that are academic, right? So our university, we have about 1,400 sponsors. We call the implementers sponsors. We designate entities to be sponsors of exchange, of J1 exchanges, so that it all goes through a State Department system to become a sponsor. There's, of course, thousands and thousands more entities that are hosts, right? So sister cities may be a sponsor, but they may place, they're going to do the administration of the individual to come on an exchange, and they may host them at sister cities, or they may work with another entity that will host them day to day in another kind of program. So a lot of universities are both hosts and sponsors of exchanges, and but we have other organizations that use the short-term scholar designation to bring Cubans over, and usually those are people with specific professional skills and expertise, and they're coming over to do joint research, to further a project. It might be part of an already long-standing relationship that's been going on between these two organizations in Cuba and in the United States. So they might work at a research institution, a museum, a library, in an academic setting, and that is exactly what our scholars were doing. We had 7 research scholars that were working in academic institutions and building the linkages between their home institution and a Cuban institution. And I bet that's what we're going to see in the next near term when I think about what private sector entities, and we say private sector not because they're, they have a board of directors and they're, in the Dow, but they're just not USG, right? They're not federal government. It's probably a term that needs changing as I think about it. But I think that that is probably where we're going to see the greatest interest, because we're going to see these academic institutions that have not already been doing this throughout the years, either starting new relationships or trying to increase the relationships that they already have. We had 19 Cuban college and university students who studied at an accredited U.S. college or university. So 49 is a number that we can build upon, and we know that a lot of you out there will want to build upon that. So I really appreciate this panel being able to discuss how to do that, because that's complicated for all of us. As you can see, it's the whole of government approach to how we face the next term. And while there will be a lot of interest and excitement, the question is, how these things will take time, right? And how long will they take? And what are going to be the steps that organizations are going to take to build the kind of ladder across to bringing people into the United States on these programs? So we would love to know what organizations out there are interested in increasing or starting new J1 exchanges. We are here as a resource. As you can see, there's some good information. It's complicated. Happily, it's less complicated. I did not bring a slide. So if you want to find us, we are j1visa.state.gov, and there's a lot of helpful information there. And I think we have some papers that are outside. We have some one-pagers out there. So find us. Can I ask anybody in my shop to raise your hand so people can find you if you have a question about J1 visas? Okay, so just ask. Anyway, I'm really happy to be here, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Let me, as the moderator, have the prerogative of the first question. Joan, you started with this point. Robin, you finished with this point in terms of time. There's give or take 1 more year available in the Obama administration, then the first 4 years of an ex-administration. What should we expect to see in the next year, and what would we like to see, say, 5 years from now in terms of the beginnings of a long-term transformation?
That's a tricky question. It's hard to define really like how this will go before. As I said before, we really are in uncharted waters. We are hoping to build bridges, and especially with the telecommunications openings and the information exchanges, we hope that some of those things will bring our countries closer together on sort of a more rapid and accelerated timeline. But many of the things that we are, communicating with the Cuban government about really depend on the Cuban government and on how much they want to move the relationship forward and how quickly they want certain themes to advance. There are topics in the bilateral relationship that I think we'll see some movement on in the next, year to 2 years, like civil aviation and some of those things. But I think there will be other topics that will take many years to grapple with, like the claims that American citizens have for property that was seized by the Cuban government back in the 50s, and the claims that the Cubans have against the United States related to the embargo, which remains in effect. And so there are a number of these issues that are really going to be longer-term issues that will be a challenge for us to work through over time. And of course, a big piece of this, PJ, is Congress and the role that Congress plays, which the executive branch can only influence to a certain point. Only Congress can lift the embargo. And so in terms of the progress that we can make, we'll have to kind of keep a close eye on that issue as well.
You worked on the Hill?
Oh, I'm not in that water. No. But I will say, it's from where I sit now, as Mary Kane said, there have already been exchanges going on. It's the robustfulness, the energy, the resourcefulness of the American people to already build those relationships. They can do so outside the government context. That is the private sector side of this, is the private sector exchange. bringing people into the United States does require a visa. It requires a visa, and that means they're here to do one of these programs that we have through a designated sponsor. So there's going to be eligibility that needs to be looked at, just like any visa applicant will have to meet eligibility requirements. But as we've already had 49 successfully doing programs, let's take the low-hanging fruit, the programs that are already successfully seeing candidates, build upon those. And I think as you get a little bit more in what's familiar territory, you can start to expand a bit more into either new institutions, new types of programs within the same types of eligibility, or more hosts in the United States that are willing to bring, have a program for people from Cuba.
From the audience, Dr. Mercedes Eubanks asked, and if I could probably slightly expand her question, she asked about, the 2016 election and the potential impact of a new administration, perhaps to expand or roll back, some of the restrictions that are in place. I suppose, for Jeff and for Alan, how much of this is reliant upon executive authority, and how much of this will be reliant on cooperation or a shared vision between the executive branch and the legislative branch going forward? And I suppose how much of this will be the private sector putting political pressure on the politicians to move perhaps faster than their political comfort level?
I don't think I can really answer that question because of the policy. We coordinate with the State Department on policy, and so if there's any changes in our policy, then our office goes forward and amends our regulations to reflect on the regulatory side what the policy is. So I don't think I could really answer that.
Yeah, similar to what Jeff said, I don't really want to speculate on what could happen in the next administration, but the changes that we've made this year have been based upon the president's authority. And so changes could be made in the future either way, depending upon who the president is.
But how much will the private sector, how fast this goes? To what extent is this controlled by government? To Joan's point about, we'll move as fast, arguably as fast as the Cuban government would do. But within our own system, what will the private sector perhaps, be able to mount some pressure that enables government to move forward, where opportunities present themselves?
I would just say, definitely the
I've got
American.
all kinds of lawyers here that don't want to.
I'm a lawyer too. The thing that PJ is really clear is that the American people support the reestablishment of relations between the United States and Cuba, and are excited about this change. I mean, the polling numbers are very clear on that front. And so, what our government does with those numbers and those indicators, I think, is anyone's guess. But clearly there is a strong movement in favor of relations, closer relations, and breaking down barriers and strengthening the communications.
And it's always important, we always say to hosts of exchange, that they serve the exchange well by showing what they're doing to their members of Congress and to their district offices. I mean, when you see, and going in local media, when you see the power, when you see your constituents really invested in building relationships and they see the benefit of exchange for their community, then they don't want to stop it, right? The economic impact that it has in a local community is very big. The more exchanges, there's spending power there. They see diversification of their communities through these exchanges. So I think they will build upon themselves, and you will definitely hear a rally from people who are invested in these exchanges. If there were a change in the current easing of restrictions, I think you would definitely hear that.
We have a question from Sendarshi from the Vietnam Education Foundation. You may have already answered this, but to what extent is the pace of the exchange programs dependent upon government funding versus private initiative?
Well, today's theme is about private initiatives for a reason. This is the easiest, we want to get those off the ground now. And as Joan mentioned, I think we're all sort of talking about What's going on with us in Cuba is a reestablishment of our diplomatic relationships and an easing of the ability of people to have purposeful travel with one another. We haven't exactly solved all of the issues that have been on the table between our two governments, but let that continue to happen. This is all about the ingenuity of these private organizations. So, and within the J1 program, we have 13 categories that people can come into the United States on. There's a number of things that can happen outbound. So it's really, I think the pace is going to be set by what people come up with. Again, though, remember there's visa eligibility requirements, and so as I sort of said, the low-hanging fruit is those that are those exchanges that are already happening, those types of exchanges.
And Jorge from Partners of the Americas is kind of asking specifically about educational exchanges. Could those be, to use your phrase, low-hanging fruit that can move, more rapidly to develop, or will there be other initiatives that we see much more prevalent early on in the effort?
Yeah, I think educational exchanges are primed for expansion. They're within the 12 exceptions. We've already seen that movement. We've seen about a 35% increase in travel, I think, this year as compared to last year in general. I don't know what the breakdown is there for educational exchanges, but we're definitely seeing an increased tendency, and we hope that will continue.
I would say that, and I would say those that are highly skilled and professional. Those are that kind of scholar to scholar level. I would say those are probably ripe for expansion. If I think about the J1 program.
Mark from Florida State University, and I think Jeff, you mentioned the impact of external events. There was an initiative during the Clinton administration in the late 1990s, and the Brothers to the Rescue tragedy took a lot of that impetus, and it ground to a halt. But now, what do you do with provisions under Helms-Burton? Other residual elements that still shape the relationship. Are there things that will have to change within Congress that allows us to accelerate? As you said, once the countries come to an understanding about what we want to do together and how rapidly we want to move down that path.
Yeah, I don't have much to offer related to views on the connection with Congress and Helms-Burton and our regulations. I guess that would be more for our policy shop, our regulatory people. So for me, as long as the regulations are in place the way they are, then my team would respond accordingly to the requests that we get related to those activities that are permissible.
Again, President Obama has called for Congress to lift the embargo, and only Congress can lift the embargo. And so, Helms-Burton and the other legislative provisions that are in place will have to be repealed kind of one by one in order for us to really make the kind of breakthrough that people, I think, are looking for in terms of trade. The regulatory changes have opened up a lot of potential in a lot of places for increased commerce and trade and exchanges and all of those kinds of things, but they can only go so far, and Congress has to take those last steps.
John McAuliffe, I think, and perhaps Jeff, you've already answered this question. The question of organized group travel and whether general licenses will be extended to individuals, families, groups to organize their own independent people-to-people trips. What are the parameters now, and what might need to change to expand that opportunity?
Yeah, the way the regulations are written now, that the travel has to be undertaken under the auspices of an organization that sponsors people-to-people travel. So individuals don't fall within the scope of that general license as far as saying, I and some friends would like to go down to Cuba and have our own educational exchange. So the regulations require that the travel take place under the auspices of an organization. and I never can speculate on the future.
To kind of wrap up, for each of you, this is a historic, transformative moment. What does it mean for the United States in terms of its bilateral relationship with Cuba? What does it mean in terms of the kind of change that we'd actually like to see in Cuba? And perhaps, how has this reset the relationship between the United States and the rest of the Western Hemisphere? Any thoughts on that as we wrap up?
Well, I would say that anytime we expand or we see a vigorous number of participants from a particular country, you just know that means the American people are being educated about that country in depth. So we cannot really know what is going on in Cuba unless we A, go there, or we spend time with people who live there. And we need to create those mechanisms for the American people to actually have real information about what's going on for people there. So the easing the restrictions really does, I mean, I almost feel like we should put the list back up, because there is a lot of purposeful travel that is now authorized, and that those people being invested in each other and the Americans that come back and explain that to their members, their lawmakers, that will make an impact in the position, maybe the perspective of those people who are writing the laws or have the chance to change laws. But it also is just going to naturally bring our countries closer together. I mean, let's just face it. When Mary gave her examples of Japan, I mean, it's amazing to me to think that, you know, there's a sister city between Japan and Hawaii, you know, and this hasn't been that long. And we're sort of trailing behind in some ways, right? So it's what you all want to do. And I think at the state, from the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs side, knowing kind of where these exchanges are happening and what's happening in them will really help us greatly. We will just want to know what's going out there so that we can kind of keep raising, so cheerleading basically. And then knowing what the obstacles are that remain and see what efforts we can make toward helping with those.
Well, the regulatory changes that we've made at the Commerce Department have really been aimed at supporting the Cuban people. And I think they have already, and I think they will continue to do so. And we certainly welcome new ideas on things that we might be able to do in the future. But I want to highlight a couple things that we did in January that supports your sorts of exchanges. For example, in the license exception support for the Cuban people that I mentioned before, it now allows certain donations for educational activities and scientific activities. It also allows certain temporary exports of items by persons departing the United States for Cuba for use in educational activities, scientific activities, professional research. So those elements of the license exception are really intended to support these exchanges with the Cuban people in Cuba. We also, although we have jurisdiction over the release of what we call technology or certain types of information to foreign nationals in the United States, including Cuba, we have certain exemptions for what we consider to be fundamental research and published information. So what we've done, again, is really aimed at supporting the Cuban people, supporting the sorts of activities, exchanges that you have with the Cuban people, and we think they'll continue to make a big difference.
You know, to say with respect to travel, the conversion from specific license requirements to a general license requirement, I would think would go a long way in facilitating, increased travel. And I mean, that's more your view as to think of what the outcome will be, but it would seem that would be the case.
For us, it's so significant to have formal, established diplomatic relations with Cuba. That's such a big change after 50 years of not having that kind of relationship, and the channels available to us, now we do, and we have the means to interact not just more with the Cuban government, but with the Cuban people on the ground. The exchanges, the people-to-people, the cultural, the academic exchanges are such a big part of this. The more information, the more technology, the more people interface with each other, the more progress we make on all fronts. And so you can't underestimate, I think, the significance of that. And the establishment of relations has also helped us, PJ, as you alluded to, in the region. there was definitely an irritant in our relationship in the region because of the Cuba issue, and we saw an overwhelmingly positive response to reestablishment of relations with Cuba from all of our regional partners. And I think everyone wants us to succeed in that bilateral relationship. And we just hope that the efforts that we're making in terms of our policy will result in a democratic, prosperous, and stable Cuba.
Please join me in thanking Robin Lerner, Alan Christian, Jeff Braunger, Joan Perkins,